In the Entrepreneurial University Pathways by Burton Clark, it is important to note that this is one area that has been under-researched. That is very few publications about how entrepreneurial universities have been funded. But it is important, many publications speak on from where Burton Clark talks about diversified income basis, which is one of the pathways. The OECD guideline framework is talking about sustainable funding. Scholars like Edskowitz, they went close to the fact that successful entrepreneurial universities, they possessed what we call venture capital or exploratory funding for exploration. But this could hold maybe for very highly the highly industrialized universities, because many universities, like in developing countries, are still trying to gain consciousness about that there's something, the funding is not sufficient. How to come out with a sustainable funding base for entrepreneurship when already the income of universities, the funding is limited, addressing several issues. These are all difficult. But we learned from Burton Clark that, yes, diversify your income bases, diversify partners from where funding comes, keep some money. We shall be seeing in the part about performance-based funding, about funding kept aside, the concept of funding kept aside. But what has been published more is about the financing of third mission of activities. And then even then, you see that there is a lot of controversy. There's a lot of controversy about the funding of third mission, where we see that many universities still, some third mission activities mostly come out as a result of the fact that they were universities were financed research. So the third mission in many universities are still financed more funding. There's the financing and also the allocation aspect of it in terms of as residual parts of the teaching and the research funding. So we generally see the general picture all over the world is the difficulty to find a stable funding for entrepreneurship. So one dimension is to look at its funding for knowledge-based entrepreneurship. Local government research funding, and there are now a lot of salutary measures by some African government. We quoted, for instance, the case of Uganda. The case of Uganda, where recently in 2019, there would seem to be, that is since the late 90s, some stable local funding by the government to finance research locally, where we see that most of the publications say that a significant part of research funding in many sub-Saharan African countries come from donors, and that issues of knowledge capitalization, research cannot Africa cannot depend on donors towards this. Industry, there's funding also to induce universities to cooperate with industry, to induce university to cooperate with industry, where we call industry, or with community funding. Okay. Another source, of course, also in many African countries is global capital, which goes by building partnerships. Okay, we have been advocating about the importance that local councils can also become, within the concept of the community innovation system, important stimulants of entrepreneurship in university. So as we say, Burton Clark talked of diversification of funding sources. The OECD guideline frameworks talks of sustainable funding strategy. We see cases also now like Makerere University, which is having now the Makerere Endowment Fund to mobilize international and local funds in order to diversify its income sources. So in terms of approaches also, there's the important role of cross-subsidization, where it is increasingly seen that to stimulate the university to go entirely entrepreneurial, funding can also be cross-subsidized from the most successful and applied universities to other ones. Of course, one department can be very successful today, and tomorrow it is not in the same magnitude. So there's the importance of creating balance between different parts of the university. We talked of discretionary funding, and it is important. This discretionary funding remains also important pathways because it enables the university to take more risk, to invest in exploratory activities. That is venture, or we could call it venture or exploratory funding. And we are now even saying that funding levels, it is not needless or useless to say universities should increase the funding levels, which is in the literature everywhere, because it is to achieve different types of entrepreneurial university, funding levels will be very determining. It would determine the profile and category of the universities. So we have talked in the narrative about how do we finance, use funding to motivate entrepreneurship in the university. We looked at in the literature, there's a lot about performance-based funding. The articles we gave have given definition, factors leading to performance-based funding, some approaches of performance-based funding. We talked of the dynamics, performance-based set apart, aside, and performance, there is an increasing use of contracts, for managing and funding results in higher education, one of which should be entrepreneurship. So what are the factors leading to performance-based funding in higher education? We talked about massification, vis-a-vis the funding basis of university. Performance-based funding is used to make strategic choices. It's used to finance some elitist function of higher education, and increasingly, entrepreneurship also, since it is not quite straightforward for might increasingly be an elitist function of the universities. So performance-based funding also represents a mechanism for differential concentration and prioritization in higher education. So I think these are things. These are so descriptive. They can be found in the in the narrative. So performance-based funding describes the drift from the traditional pattern of block funding, which was based on expenditures, to new result-oriented funding. So the dynamics of performance-based funding come from business organizations. It is the use of financial incentive as the instrument to guide the achievement of specific objectives. It is tied directly to the performance of institutions and individuals and groups on the basis of predefined indicator. So when we talk about contracts, we talk about setting some income aside. Also, indicator is one of the dynamics that is based on allocating according to achievement of previous achievements. Also can be one indicator, or based on certain established future objective. So it is a new contract, social contract for universities to demonstrate value for money. The use of private sector tools in the management of universities. We know, for instance, that South Africa and a few African universities have adopted it, but we believe, we found in the literature that for some universities that have gone to entrepreneurial or even achievements in research that leads to entrepreneurial undertakings have been based on the use of performance-based instrument. So it accompanies new managerialism or the new public management theory in higher education. It is a market model of resource as allocation. So it follows performance-based funding in the West, especially Europe, has been a follow-up to different shifts of higher education in higher education. Peter Stokes in 2000 talked about reinvention of the government, a transition from the state supervisory model, the evaluative state, and our colleague here, Yusuf Krivisto, who will be coming on as one of our guests for the interactive session, has talked about the principal agencies theory, where when the state devolves autonomy to universities, it employs other means about keeping the university's performance. Goniska and colleagues talks about it's a disguised form of state tiering of higher education. Performance-based funding helps to bridge information asymmetry and build the trust between the sponsor, which may be the government, and the agent, which is the university. Meaning that the government has developed, since 1990s, there has been a lot about changing from the traditional state supervisory models in higher education to more autonomous organization. And as we see in Finland, in the session on Finland, we see that this is taking place to enable universities bear their risk, take their initiatives, to be more entrepreneurial. So one of the rationale for performance-based funding is to achieve efficiency and accountability. One of the driving force also, or dynamics again, if we identified the other dynamics like indicators, money kept aside and so on, is to stimulate competition amongst different units and different staff. So we have the use of indicators. Within indicators, we have input and output indicators. We have single and multiple indicators. So according to the output indicators, the use of output indicators is based on the fact that current results provides clues of action in the past, and work carried out predicts or becomes visible in future. And then we talked about already the use of contracts. So the performance-based funding, it builds on the fact that it increases returns, that there is a correlation between incentives and return. Efforts expended optimize the competitiveness and efficiency of activities in university. And extrinsic monetary reward for staff to be efficient if they expect their behaviors to result in desired outcome, in this case, extrinsic rewards. So based on the studies we cite, we find a situation where a university sets objectives, and one of the expectations is that academics will constantly motivated by the incentive to accomplish more. Since accomplishment attracts more incentives and their performance will increase. Projects and accomplishments serves as indicators for future success of projects. And to some academic prospects, these indicators serve as prospects for success in their applications. So indicators, for instance, helps to reduce the information asymmetry. That is, you see from the past that this guy has been able to do this. You can predict whether he will be able to do the next or not. The whole idea is that the market in which universities operate is very imperfect. Hence, the need for indicators to approximate the many dimensions of their inputs. So indicators help heighten pressures on academics to invest more efforts. The use of performance contracts performance contracts are regulators. The induced commitment of the agent, which may be a department or a research group or an individual. Basing allocations on competitive criteria is one way of setting incentive for competitive practices. So in the study that we highlighted in the narrative, it is important some countries use performance-based funding schemes to stimulate system-wise performance. Some of them, for instance, are to stimulate access, intake. Some are like output, such as graduates. So example of input indicator are funding allocated based on targeted number of students. The outcome or output or result model, here funding is determined by the number of credits and earned or job placement. So this system-wise now focuses on institutions, on performance that institutions must achieve. So earn credits can be used also as indicators of performance. The case of Sweden. Here in Denmark, for long, the United Kingdom has used earned credits or job placements as the output model. In Sweden, it has been the use of earned credits, Sweden and Norway. There is also, we identify programmatic performance-based funding, targeting program or strategic importance and relevance to national development. The institutional aspect, targeting structural differentiation. I mean, we see the case of Finland, in the section of Finland, that the structural division between the comprehensive university has been used as a basis for defining performance-based contracts between new types of institutions and the comprehensive universities on the different achievements that they must produce to present to the government. So a differential concentration on funding between research and teaching universities, between also a diversity of institutions such as new vocational institutions. So the government states, you know, the type of achievements that or indicators that the universities must produce. Thank you very much for this session today.